Okay, well, let me get to our presentation. Okay, so I just want to do a little bit of introduction here. So I've been practicing CEQA almost 40 years. I'm a long-term planner for a number of local rural municipalities, and I have a responsibility for monitoring sites for mitigation compliance. I've been with my firm SHN since 2016. Before that, I had my own private consulting firm for 20 years. I am on the San Francisco board of AEP. I teach the CEQA NEPA class at Humboldt State University for the last 13 years, currently with engineering students. And I also help teach our local advanced CEQA courses. So, and one other thing, I'll talk briefly about it later on, but our team was involved in the EIR analyzing the construction-related impacts of removal of 3 Klamath River dams. So, and I mentioned some of it because this presentation is has been qualified for 1 AICP credit in the law section. So I'll be sure if you're an AICP member to keep that in mind. So I gave this presentation, well, a related one, a much shorter one at the state conference in Long Beach. And Frances had asked me to provide a presentation to her group down there, and we decided we would team present on this. So I stole this core services from our marketing firm. I'm not marketing our services, but the different services that are here, these are all disciplines that are used in construction mitigation measures. And so it really does take a team. And so feel free to reach out to people that have these skills as you, again, prepare for mitigation. And I also just wanted to put in our service area of Northern California. So a third of the state still exists above San Francisco and Sacramento. So we're the true Northern California portion of it. We also have offices and experience in Southern Oregon. So why construction mitigation? This is what we're going to be talking about, focusing on site preparation, hydrology, grading, erosion control, and restoration. So typically when we look at CEQA documents, we get the figure on the left. And then eventually this project gets built. This is actually a construction project in Arcata that is currently being constructed. But what we're going to talk about today is even before the first 2x4 shows up on the site. So what about site preparation and getting the site ready for construction? So I was, when I was first asked to present at the state conference, they wanted me to present on construction mitigation measures. And it's like, well, why not just talk about regular mitigation? And I was told that in urban areas that a lot of times you're not dealing with a whole lot of construction. Most of it's operational. Most of the focus is on air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, noise, traffic, lighting, and the such. So in rural areas, most of our mitigation does need to focus on both construction impacts and operational impacts. So our focus then is on construction impacts. So, and one of the things to point out is rarely when we get a project description do we see much about the construction activity. We're supposed to analyze short-term impacts, but again, they don't typically come as part of project descriptions. So construction is typically years down the pipe, and permitting agencies take care of that, right? Thinking about Water Board and CDFW. Well, actually not. So I just want to talk a couple slides on Mitigation 101. One of the things we try to promote is that mitigation measures need to be effective and firm and yet flexible enough to adapt to change. And when we do mitigation monitoring reporting plans, we're looking at the 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, why, and sometimes how. So thinking about this, these are things that fall in our MMRP. So Frances, I'm going to ask you to load up our first polling question. Looking at the first, who is the who? Who is responsible for checking compliance? And think, so maybe pick 1 or 2. Who do you typically put down for the construction aspect of your MMRP? Okay, the numbers are coming in, slowing down a bit. Hurry up, press a button. You want to end the poll, Francis, and share the results.
Sure. Ending now.
So, okay, so our building engineering departments are basically about half, 45%. Planners are rarely involved in looking at this. The applicant is another large group. And then some of you have specific CEQA compliance folks on site. So that's a great answer. So we'll move on. So great. So there's a reason I asked that question. But before we get to that, so some distinctions when we talk about mitigation. So a lot of times when you get a project description, especially something that an environmental consultant has helped with preparing, is you have design features built into the project description. Those are important to note in of themselves and take credit in the CEQA process. There's also regulatory compliance, a lot of federal, state, or local government requirements. And so mitigation measures really is tailored to fill in the gap between those first two bullet points and to bring the project down to less than significant. So if it's a design feature and you want to make sure it's not lost in the process, don't make it a mitigation measure, make it a condition of approval. And really with mitigation measures, if you're proposing a mitigation measure and it's removed, then there should be a potential significant impact as a result. So again, a lot of mitigation measures are more properly conditions of approval. So, and as an example, so I worked on a project and the applicant was proposing black vinyl chain link fencing, and the lead agency put a mitigation measure and they said, well, we want green vinyl chain link fencing. It fits in better with the environment. And I said, well, if you don't require green and black goes up, is that a significant impact? And they responded, yes, emphatically. But then I asked them, well, what is the threshold of significance? Where does it change from black to green? And they hem and hawed. And as a result, we ended up with the black vinyl chain link fencing. So again, mitigation measures should be very specific, but through the CEQA process, you should be taking advantage of noting design features and regulatory compliance. And here's just a few examples. So mitigation measures, again, is the gap between a project's significant impacts and bringing it down to less than significant. So who do these differences, or why do these differences matter? Here's a couple examples. So we just want to make sure that the public and the applicant is aware of the distinctions, that we're aware of what they're doing, and our CEQA documents reflect that. One of my mantras is to anticipate and avoid, not to assess and fix. So I know we have a few folks from Caltrans today, and what the story I've heard about our highways up here in North Coast was it was at a time when materials were expensive and labor was fairly cheap. And so literally cutting corners was the best option for some of our highways. It seemed better to go through unstable areas than to go around them. And now Caltrans spends a lot of time and effort on assessing and fixing those problems instead of avoiding them in the first place. So not a criticism, that was just something that happened back in the day. So, and now of course, labor is very expensive. So anticipating and avoiding is really key to mitigating construction impacts. And again, it means that you have to really understand the construction and the process, the equipment, the timing of things. When we talk about mitigation, we sometimes hear about that there's 5 types and they're hierarchical. This is actually from NEPA. So if you look at a lot of NEPA, if you look at NEPA and a lot of the agency guidelines, they list these 5 types of mitigation. They're hierarchical. When you go to CEQA in 15370, you find the same 5, but there is no mention on one being more important than the other. So again, how do we reduce impacts? Thinking about these, I'm going to go over each of these 5 types and give some examples related to construction. So avoidance is really what it means. Avoidance and minimization are the two minimization measures that I talked about earlier that usually comes in on a good project design. But you're looking at some of these different things. One that's often forgotten is time activities to avoid critical periods, such as nesting and breeding, weather, or even school bus traffic comes up. So, and we are designing or redesigning projects to avoid significant impacts. If you don't have impacts, you don't have to have mitigation. And just some examples. Screening all or most storage areas. I won't read these, but greenhouse gas emissions. So if you're not using a climate action plan and you're using something like Cal-EMOD modeling for your construction, oftentimes we don't know how many days of construction, what types of equipment, how many people. Those are all defaults for construction Cal-EMOD, and the person preparing it may not have that information, and you can either add or subtract the impacts based on those default answers. And so you really want to determine a specific construction project if you're using the Cal-EMOD model, or at least get the best information that you can. So you may need to change the days, the hours, or the types of equipment based on that. For biology, I think it's only in the last few years that the idea that pre-construction nesting bird surveys are federal law, but they need to be brought in as requirements. And that nesting birds don't only nest in trees, but also grasslands or weed patches. One of the not mitigation measures, but one of the techniques for minimizing impact is actually to allow vegetation clearing to occur prior to the nesting season. So that's okay for biology. There might be some other issues related to that, but bats are becoming an issue more. And there's a very slim period for when roosting and nesting does not occur and when you can use exclusions. CDFW has protocols for bats, as Caltrans has a mitigation plan when projects are bringing them in. So if you're not dealing with bats right now, I know of a local project that actually got held up because they did not address bats. And then construction noise and lighting. Where do you consider that in your CEQA document? Is that in the biology section, or is it in the noise section and the aesthetic section? So again, thinking about other aspects of avoiding and minimizing. Here's an example of horizontal directional drilling, where instead of going through a waterway, you go down and around, coming up the surface. So, and then mitigation can have impacts. So you need to have mitigation for mitigation. So again, you got to bring in your construction techniques to analyze in CEQA. So this was the standing rock controversy that some of you may be familiar with. With minimization, we're looking at if we can't avoid, then we minimize the impact. So if you can't locate outside the flood zone, you elevate the structure. If you can't avoid nighttime lighting, you keep the light standards low on timers. If you can't avoid cultural resources, then you pave over it for protection. If you can't avoid building on prime ag soils, you might include a conservation easement over the remaining lot area. And again, some examples here. Not as good as avoid, but some actual examples. Okay, one example is just using fences and subways to control access of small animals. We might all be familiar with the City of Davis's toad tunnel, which is basically a culvert underneath the road to direct the toads that usually hop on the road, and exclusionary areas around it so that the toads are forced into going through the culvert. We also have exclusionary fencing in construction areas. If installed correctly, you would have this flap at the top that overlaps so animals, so in this case, a salamander doesn't go over into the construction site. As we know, the grass is always greener on the other side. The third type of mitigation is to rectify or to fix. This is what we typically do for construction. And this was, again, opposed to the idea that we're supposed to anticipate and avoid. But for much, it is required. So again, with noise, sometimes we mitigate the limits of the activities and we focus on the noise producing activities of construction. Some jurisdictions have limitations on the construction time. And again, one of the questions is, would you rather have 8 hours a day for 6 weeks or 10 hours a day for 4 weeks? Is prolonging the noise better? Does it interfere with the nearby residential activity? So something to consider. Transportation, hydrology, biology, replacing bridges and culverts to be fish friendly or pass a 100-year flood. This is typical. It's required other than through CEQA as far as getting a CDFW permit or other Army Corps or county permits. So again, being careful of the Nolan-Dolan cases, we want to make sure that there's a nexus or the type of mitigation matches the impact and then it's proportional. When we think about rectifying, we often think about erosion control or just restoration. So the photo on the left is restoration. The photo on the right is hydroseeding in a restoration project. We have we had a proposal for doing wind turbines on Bear River Ridge, and one of the major impacts was actually trying to get the equipment up on the road and requiring major road cuts to allow that, and that would cause the erosion and long-term instability. So operational impacts are typically fall under minimization measures instead, but for construction we spend a lot of time rectifying. So we're going to do grading and erosion control. We're going to mess things up during construction, and then we're going to fix it before we leave the project. Again, multiple purposes for erosion control and rectifying. It allows some better vegetation in addition to just breaking up the surface water flows. Another example of using koi netting or jute netting on bench slopes, having fast growing sterile plants like barley. In this instance, this photo is using vetiver grass, something that has limited application in California because there's always a concern that the vetiver grass as an invasive would get away, but it is considered sterile. It only reproduces asexually. And so the experts seem to suggest there's low risk for vetiver grass to spread because the seeds won't germinate. But again, there's controversy in this. And if someone's proposing it, you should know a little bit about vetiver grass. Is it a good erosional control method or is it not? So, and then the fourth type of mitigation is reducing over time. So aesthetics, another reason we do reclamation of sites. I couldn't think of if you have air quality issues during construction, how do you reduce it over time afterwards? But another reduced over time is planting wetland areas to achieve habitat values in 5 years. So, which also means loss of habitat for 4 years. So we start thinking about reclamation of sites. Quarries are some things we do through the Surface Mining and Reclamation Act. Industrial sites, we have not been very good at requiring removal of the improvements that they put on it. So we're often stuck with mill sites that have not been redeveloped and have the old equipment there. Energy projects, it's becoming more popular. Wind turbines typically have a 50-year life, and so some CEQA documents are requiring that the equipment all be removed after 50 years. And here's just an example of the before and after mine reclamation. So this could take 50 years. We have some reclamation plans that have been approved. And again, there's enough material there to last more than 50 years. And then the last one, and wetland mitigation could be either reduced over time or compensation. But compensation is basically paying impact fees for different purposes. And again, some examples, a little bit more difficult in construction, thinking about how we can compensate. But Again, this is typically the lowest on the hierarchy list, but people are starting to rethink of it. Do we save little pocket wetlands for biology or contribute to a larger wetland mitigation bank? So that was not a very popular concept years ago. It's being re-looked at now. Under noise, this is actually has happened as people can't stand the noise. A lot of times our highway paving occurs at nighttime, and I know one applicant and neighbors were happy that during that nighttime asphalt making that they actually paid neighbors to stay at a hotel room. One other point is I want to bring up is that there's a lot of times there's a disconnect between when you write the mitigation measures and when that is implemented, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but just aware that there's this disconnect. So I'm going to make 3 main points. This is the first one, and that's really to get to know your construction window chart. So the first row there shows our construction season. This is specific for Humboldt, is typically mid-April to mid-October. But the weather sometimes continues on into May or June, and so it already shortens our construction season. When we think about biology, we're avoiding all the migrating birds. We have amphibians, we have down migration of salmonids, and so our construction season, because of biology, gets further limited. And then we think about nesting birds. So typically August 15th is when we don't have to do pre-construction nesting surveys. And so we're starting to end up with, out of the whole year for construction in Humboldt, we end up with this 8-week period between mid-August to mid-October. That also happens to be wildfire. So you can see under that row, we don't have any colored squares. We're in the peak of wildfires, though nowadays they say that it's year round. But again, keeping that in mind, if you're doing work in stream courses, it's even further limited if you have to wait for the stream to go dry. Erosion control, I put this in here because we really should start erosion control early on in the construction season so that the seeds have all had a chance to establish themselves. But because we're still constructing, that isn't always possible. But ideally, we'd be getting started early on before the first rains start to come. Restoration, a lot of times we have to wait for the rains to happen in order to do restoration. I just had a permit that included a restoration aspect. It was an Army Corps permit, and they required everything be done by November 1st. And I tried to say, well, can we get an extension to do restoration in January, February when we need to do that? And the answer was no. So again, keeping in mind when is the best time for these. And then vacations, often neglected. So construction workers are typically not allowed to take vacations during their busy construction season, but the building official who is doing your mitigation monitoring for you may be on vacation, the planner that may be CDFW, and the water board may be on vacation at those times. So again, keeping these things are important. Know what your construction window is. Okay, just as an example of a potential disconnect, this is the one of the Klamath dams to be removed. This is the Iron Gate Dam, the oldest one that's there. And again, just for perspective, you might look at the buildings that are at the lower part of the structure. So, you know, as we were looking at this, working on the EIR, the question really came up, who will be on site to make sure it happens correctly? And that's really was key to all the aspects of this project. This project was all construction related. There was no real operational aspect. Once restoration occurred and the river was back into some channel, that was the end of the project. So the project was all construction mitigation. So, and one of the things, you know, as we realized, and again, they did not have the contractor on contract. And so a lot of construction has to, what they actually do has to do with the contractor's preferences. But we had people, because of that, that had to be on site to make sure mitigation occurred. So we had 10 to 20 biological mitigation measures, as you can picture. We had 20 to 30 water quality mitigation measures. But in addition, we had reports that had to be submitted implementing waste disposal, traffic safety, wildfire prevention, emergency response, health and safety, contaminants, noise, air quality, erosion control. So again, how do you make sure mitigation measures are complied with? We did a recent project for a wastewater treatment facility expansion. There were 53 mitigation measures and conditions of approvals and permit requirements in there. So how do you make sure that all gets tracked? And one of the things that we did there is we used something like a mitigation monitoring reporting plan. But instead of doing it alphabetically, which is typical in CEQA, we specified who was in charge and when. And so I would just recommend for CEQA that you would consider your MMRP, instead of doing it alphabetically, consider when does the mitigation measure need to apply. And you might lump some of the mitigation compliance on who is actually doing the work. So one of the questions, I'm going to do a series of problems and solutions. The first one is, what is the role of a CEQA practitioner? And does a CEQA preparer only care about getting to the finish line for CEQA, or do they care about the environment they're tasked with protecting? So what's the ethical responsibility? And again, in other words, if you say your mitigation measure will be implemented, what's your responsibility after saying it? So that's getting to the second point I wanted to mention. When does your role or responsibility end? And this is not really solutions, but again, if you look at the AICP ethics statement, it talks about protection of environment. A lot of companies that, or agencies that you work for have missions and value statements that say that's going to happen. And of course, your own reputation. So thinking about the role and what will we typically say. So if an environmental consultant like myself will tell the lead agency, if you adopt these mitigation measures, there won't be a potential for significant impact. The lead agency tells the planning commission, if you adopt these mitigation measures, there won't be a potential for significant impact. The planning commission tells the public, who has extensively expressed concerns about the project, well, we're going to adopt these mitigation measures, so don't worry about it anymore. And then the project gets approved, there's an MMRP. The applicant is told you're going to have to do these mitigation measures. And then they disappear, they go get their other permits. And then at some point in the future, when they're ready, they apply for building permits. This might be a time that the question is, do the mitigation measures and conditions of approval follow? Is there a referral process so that they're brought into the building permit, or is the building official only concerned with the actual building permit? So, and then it goes on. So then the applicant then is responsible. They pass the responsibility onto the contractor, and the contractor passes on the responsibility to the equipment operator. Now, the equipment operator might be just a high school graduate, summertime work. They know how to run a front end loader or something. Or it could be a union contractor who's got 20 years experience, which is the person I mostly have problems with. So I will explain in CEQA big terms what they're supposed to do, and they will nod their heads and with understanding, and they'll do whatever they normally do, ignoring everything I said. It's really not their job. So again, the question is, who do you write mitigation for? So if you're using terms like BMP or retrofits or inadvertent discovery, does the equipment operator understand those terms? And who do they go to find out what the meaning of those things are? So again, whose responsibility is it going to be? So let me ask you this second question. Francis, if you pull up the second question, very similar to the first one. So whose responsibility is it to make sure mitigation is properly mitigated? And you can answer all that apply. Okay, a couple more seconds. Okay, Francis, you want to share end the poll and share the results? Yeah, so showing a lot of people have responsibility to make sure. And of course, if everyone's pointing fingers at the other person, then it never really quite happens. But again, it's a shared responsibility. Another question might be, well, if it doesn't work out, who gets to wear the handcuffs? But all right. Thank you. So again, an MMRP, the typical role of an MMRP that I feel is it's to make sure that your mitigation works. If you can't answer the who, what, where, when, how adequately, then you need to rewrite your mitigation measures. But it's not really effective for passing on and making sure that mitigation gets taken care of. So the lead agency, they're going to be busy on the next project working on. The building official, they're really good on site. They make regular inspections, but what do they know about nesting birds? Or some may be adequate in erosion control, some may not be. They're really making sure that the construction occurs according to the building code. The applicant and their contractor, again, who is really taking on the responsibility. Construction manager. So a lot of public projects have construction managers and engineer on site. They're going to make sure that the construction occurs correctly, and they may be able to make sure erosion control is also adequate. But again, they're not necessarily qualified to look at biology or restoration or even cultural aspects. So it's not a new idea, but it's really, I'm trying to promote that we really need someone boots on the ground that makes sure that CEQA monitoring happens. So again, thinking past the CEQA document for the Klamath Dam removal, what was it that I could have done? Now my contract ended, so I'm not working on that project anymore, but could I have taken steps to make sure that the mitigation measures is implemented? How does that get stated into the CEQA document and hopefully followed through with? So. Knowing the sensitivity of your construction site differs. So again, a lot of lead agency staff people don't get to get out to the site, but there's a lot of differences between one site and another site. So one size fits all doesn't necessarily work well. So again, construction timing, weather dependent work. A lot depends on timing. If we miss a CEQA deadline, if we miss a deadline by a couple of weeks, it could postpone a project over a year. Because after CEQA there's this whole multiple agency permitting. So, or more than likely the construction occurs that year, whatever it might be, but it's pushed into the wet periods of the year or some other constraint, biological constraints, and have more serious environmental impact than what was analyzed in CEQA. So we typically schedule projects to know when, work backwards from when the planning commission or the city council or board of supervisors adopts the CEQA document, but we really should be looking at the whole process. When do you hope to start construction? So we hope to start construction in June 1st. Well, that means our other permits need to be submitted by December of the year previous, which means that CEQA needs to be completed by September, which means that your application to the lead agency for CEQA has to be done January. So, you know, those things, we should be looking at the whole process and when mitigation occurs and set up deadlines. And this typically happens with CEQA consultants, but not necessarily with lead agencies that are unfamiliar with the whole construction process. And one of the first things we do, and the simplest and most common, is when we get approval to go out there, large ground is disturbed, so vegetation is scraped off. The surveyors come in and stake the grading plan, then all the grading happens, and then the construction happens. So this is the period of time I'm talking about for the construction impacts related to hydrology and grading and such. It happens very quickly at the very beginning, so all the other steps can follow. And again, this may be, and in this instance, late in the season and bumping up against the rainy season. So, and when we talk about large ground disturbance, you probably have heard of low impact development, LID, related to stormwater, which is a very strange name for dealing with stormwater. But if you read about LID, or low impact development, there's a lot that occurs prior to dealing with runoff and stormwater and such. And so there's some interesting reads on there. You might be interested. So again, the first three is typically the avoidance and minimization, and the last two are typically the stormwater issues. So if you're starting with stormwater with LID, then you're missing the first 3 points. What about the heavy equipment? What's the size of equipment? I sent boys with toys, and I didn't want to be gender specific, so women on equipment. When you write mitigation measures, think about who's going to be implementing them. So a person 12 feet off the ground in a dusty environment using an excavator with a 5-yard bucket isn't going to really have much control or see things from that aspect. If you tell them they're supposed to be looking for something that looks like a rock but isn't a rock, are they really going to be paying attention to that? Can they actually see something like that? And I know it works, but for inadvertent discovery for cultural resources, just rewriting what we typically put in. If the equipment operator sees something that looks like a rock but isn't a rock, they're supposed to get off their equipment, take a closer look, and then notify their boss. The boss, if they don't know what it is to shut down the work site in that area until approval is received. All the workers go home, but the boss doesn't know who to ask or how to get a hold of someone. 2 days later, they figure it out and notify the tribe, who will make a site visit 3 days later after an agreement to get paid is made. The tribal monitor makes it to the site and says, no problem, just a rock. Workers return to the site and work resumes after a week shutdown, and of course, everyone is happy. So I know there's been successes in this. It's always a good thing to have, but is it really going to work? Another issue is with air quality and water quality. When you have air quality problems and when it starts to rain, that dust and everything becomes a water quality issue. So coordinating your air quality and water quality sections in your CEQA document is important. And again, learning the terms to use. So air issues become hydrology issues later. So again, just coordinating those two issues. So what's the problem here? We drove up to this subdivision that was being constructed. And this is what we said, if we were the water board, you might get a $10,000 fine for doing what you're doing. And this was the response we got. But so what problems do you see here? So they're working in the rain. You can see sediment in the gutter. That's not really the problem. You got someone cleaning his sprayer at the storm drain inlet. And when we pointed that out, his response was, it's water soluble. There's no problem with that. This drain inlet, as you probably can imagine, drains to a nearby creek. The real problem in this look is if you look at the downspout, it's trenched over to the curb. And so instead of taking care of your roof runoff on your landscaping, it's being plumbed to drain directly to the curb. So having a lot more water quality issues there. In a bigger scale, here is a subdivision. Again, a lot of straw spread out, but nothing green. You can see this was applied too late, probably right before the storm happened. They did do some kind of retrofitting for the storm, adding the gravel to these LID features, but any kind of straw or hydroseeding was worthless if not established before the first rains, and you get this muddy mess. And again, if the person in that car was a water board person, there could be fines being written for this. Also notice they went to the trouble of landscaping their LID features, but no erosion control here. This was another project. This was a bridge replacement. They removed the bridge. They scattered some straw when an unexpected storm was forecast. Fortunately, a lot of this area was gravelled, but again, the rains came and affected this construction site, and there was a muddy mess. So this was a salmon bearing creek. The construction was delayed because of a grading permit, and of course there was an unexpected storm. This was a separate and a different bridge construction project. This one had a construction monitor on site to make sure erosion control was put on in time. They actually have their bridge in there, but again, they use some quick sprouting barley in this case to and hand strewn straw. And again, this is a salmon creek. This occurred a year later than the previous one, but it was within 10 miles of each other. So again, understanding the science behind erosion control. And I think I'm going to just end with, this was a restoration project. This was actually upstream of that bridge that we just looked at. If you look at the upper left corner, you had rough grading going in. As they finished the project, they had this, I don't know what you call it, they shot the straws, which munches up the straw into small pieces. So a lot less effective than actually going out by hand and doing it, but they had a lot of area to cover. There was an unexpected storm here. You can see from the lower left photo, a lot of the straw got washed away, as well as the seeds and everything. And then the bottom right photo, in the springtime, everything did finally come up. You can see the erosion that occurred along the stream bank. But again, blowing straw is not the same as spreading straw. So really knowing the necessities of erosion control and such. And then restoration takes time. So a lot of projects require using native seeds, which are slow to germinate, or native plants, which are slow to grow, where erosion control seed mixes are fast, but they're not necessarily appropriate. Some still have perennial rye, which is an inhibitor for other types of plants to grow near it. And so again, thinking about the speed of needing erosion control. So some alternatives there. I think I'll end on this slide to save time for some question, but nuking the graded surfaces or using herbicides, and there are trade-offs for that. Redwood National Park had a prohibition for years, and as they finally reached the conclusion that they could not get rid of certain invasives, they started using very selective herbicide for making some progress. Tilling flat areas twice. I mean, you got a seed bank that is in there that's been there for years and years and years. You have to, if you can't get rid of the plants, then at least get them to germinate, the seeds to germinate, and then tilling it again and again and again. So adding soil supplements will keep certain plants from growing, changing the pH in smaller areas. Is good. Using fast growing sterile seeds such as barley. Regreen is basically a sterile barley. Vetiver grass, again in the photo you can see vetiver grass being used for erosion control, and it stays where it is planted. And then just doing invasive species control. So, well, I think I'll end there. So I have a few more slides to go.
So Bob, we have a couple questions. I'll just start from the top. This is related to bat impacts. This person's asking what kind of bat impacts are being experienced right now, and what are typical mitigation measures for this? Okay,
good. And you actually talked about nesting birds too. So buildings that are disused are a lot of times occupied by bats. Some of you are familiar with barn swallows that will also occupy there, but once they're roosted there, how do you keep them from occupying the building when you need to? So really bat surveys need to occur well prior to construction. And for us here, we have a slim window, I think it's November to February, where the bats may migrate off the site. And so if we want to block any kind of entrances for bats, we're really limited to that period, November through February. once they're there, especially once they're nesting, it really can hold up construction in that area. But again, do a search for CDFW. They have the BAT protocols, which will explain a lot more to that. And I think you'd probably be able to find something from Caltrans on the BAT mitigation projects.
Okay. And then we have a question from Heather. She's asking about noise ordinances. So it looks like Heather works in a public agency. So in our code, we have a pretty rough and vague reference to noise. And in our general plan, it has a maximum noise and ground vibrations, but it doesn't discuss temporary construction noise. She's curious about whether there needs to be a fix to the code or what kind of measures we can use to control construction noise.
Okay, well, that's good. So typical noise level restrictions are based on, I mean, a lot of it is, especially during the sensitive period at nighttime, is so that residential areas can get to sleep. So there's not sleep depredation. That's really what those standards are about. And then outdoor noise standards so that you can actually have a barbecue and enjoy things. But for construction noise, they're typically short term. You're not really talking about loss of hearing. That usually takes a long-term exposure. So I've seen mitigation measures that eliminates all construction activities during construction periods, rather than just the noise producing aspect. So there's a lot of construction that does not require making noise. That would be one thing. And then, you know, the averaging methods using LDN or CNEL doesn't really work well for those standards. I think the best construction, I know I mentioned a little bit about it, but limiting the period of time that construction can occur. Again, and it's a bad assumption, but assuming that everyone is working in out of their residence during the 8 to 5 period or whatever, that wouldn't be true now, but working virtual and stuff. And then the other aspect of noise, and there are standards looking at migratory nesting birds. So I don't know if I answered that, but I think it's a good question. So we're typically, our noise sections refer to operational noise, long-term noise, not so much construction-related noise. And that is where the noise vibration, the ground vibration question comes up, is under noise. Not a lot of people do much about that question because of the understanding, but construction equipment does have ground vibration aspects to it.
Okay, can you expand on when you would add a noise mitigation measure in the aesthetics section? Or did I hear him correctly? I don't think you actually mentioned. I think the question from Janet Powell, we were not discussing aesthetics. It was more in our noise section when we would include construction noise mitigation.
Yeah, what I said was, where do you consider noise in relationship to biology? Is it in the biology section or in the noise section? But I did mention lighting, and lighting is in the aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
We're concerned with lighting and glare typically of neighboring properties, but has an impact on biology as well. So do you address biological impacts related to lighting in the aesthetic section or in the biology section?
Okay. And then just to clarify, someone in the chat asked whether the presentation and recording will be available to attendees. Yes, the presentation is being recorded right now, and then I believe Bob will be sending out the link to the video later.
Correct. And Zoom will send you a link thanking you for attending, or those who did not do it. And in there we have our North Coast AEP APA YouTube site. But after this gets down, the recording gets downloaded, I usually find the specific link to it. So that Zoom message you'll get tomorrow will have the link to this presentation.
And one more person mentioned our team doesn't mind if you keep going through your slides, but it looks like we're at the 1 o'clock time, and the PowerPoint that you'll be sending out will have all of your slides, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so I guess we'll be able to review that on our own.
Yes, there were only a few more left, but so anyway.
Okay, and then one final question, not related to the presentation. Crystal's asking, where do we get information about the AEP student membership opportunity?
Okay, good question. I did at the very beginning of the chat put the califaep.org website there, or if you just search for AEP, well, I guess there's probably a couple other associations, but California AEP, but it's CALIFAEP.org. We'll have all that information available. And again, that student membership is also for high schools and community colleges. Well, great. Well, thank you everybody for attending, and have a safe holiday, and we'll see you around the corner.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everyone.